Picture this. It's a snowy night in March 2015. An Air Canada flight is on its final approach. Everything seems completely normal, but in just a few moments, what should have been a routine landing is about to turn into a terrifying fight for survival. So what are we dealing with here? Well, you got a modern Airbus A320, a real workhorse of the skies. In the cockpit, you have two pilots who are absolute pros with more than 23,000 flight hours between them. But the one wild card is outside. A blizzard is absolutely raging over their destination in Halifax, Canada. All the ingredients for a standard, if pretty challenging flight. So how on earth does a perfectly good plane with a seasoned crew end up in a wreck just short of the runway? It just doesn't add up, right? Well, that is the mystery we are unpacking in this explainer. Alright, so our story begins on a cold spring evening. Flight 6 hours 0 minutes and 20 seconds 4 is pushing back from the gate in Toronto, getting ready for a simple 2-hour hop over to the East Coast. Let's just break it down. On board we've got 138 people, the captain and first officer. We are talking serious experience here, especially on this type of plane. They're well rested, they have great safety records, but there's one huge variable they can't control, the weather waiting for them. It is getting worse by the minute. Heavy snow, powerful winds, and visibility that's just dropping like a rock. So as they get closer to Halifax, the situation gets complicated. That severe weather basically forces the pilots into a corner. They can't use the runway with the best, most automated landing equipment. And that means they have to fly a much more demanding, much more hands-on type of approach. And this right here shows you the critical difference. A standard ILS approach, think of it like the plane is on invisible rails. It gives the pilots a perfect automated ramp for both their direction and their altitude. But because of the wind, they were stuck using runway 0.5. And as you can see, that runway only gives them horizontal left-right guidance. That vertical guidance boof gone. Managing their descent was now entirely up to them. Okay, so how are they gonna manage this? Well, they have a piece of tech for that. It's called flight path angle mode. The pilots did the math and figured they needed a 3.5-degree descent. So you basically just dial that angle into the autopilot and in theory, the plane should fly that perfect path all the way down through the snow. But here's where things get really insidious. There was an invisible force working against them, a hidden danger born from the extreme cold itself. It was warping their most fundamental instrument for measuring altitude. And the pilots had absolutely no idea it was happening. So wait. How is that even possible? How can the temperature outside trick a multi-million-dollar airliner into flying dangerously low? It sounds kind of crazy, right? Well, it all comes down to this one instrument, the altimeter. And here's the key thing to understand. It's not a measuring tape. It's really just a sensitive barometer. It measures air pressure based on the simple fact that pressure drops the higher you go. But it's all calibrated for a standard temperature. And the problem is, the air that night was anything but standard. It was brutally cold. And what does cold air do? It gets dense. It shrinks. So imagine the layers of air pressure in the atmosphere are like an accordion. The intense cold was squeezing that accordion together, compressing all the layers closer to the ground. And that's the trap. The altimeter is reading the correct pressure and it's telling the pilots, yep, we're at 2,000 feet. But because that whole pressure layer has been squashed down closer to the ground by the cold, the plane's true altitude is actually hundreds of feet lower. Their most trusted instrument was feeding them a dangerous lie. So you've got this physics problem, which is bad enough. But it gets worse because that problem was about to collide with a major blind spot in the airline's own procedures. A blind spot that would prevent the pilots from ever realizing the danger they were in. Okay, check this out. On one side, you have what Airbus, the people who actually made the plane, say to do. They tell pilots to constantly cross-check their altitude against their distance, making little tweaks. But Air Canada's procedure at the time was, well, different. It was essentially a set-it-and-forget-it approach. You dial in the descent angle and then just watch. And this is just heartbreaking, it wasn't that the pilots were lazy or careless. They were doing exactly what they were trained to do. But because they weren't required to do those constant cross-checks, they remained, as the report says, blissfully ignorant. They had no idea that shifting winds were causing the plane to drift lower and lower off the ideal path. And just when you think it can't get any worse, one more thing goes wrong, a simple human error on the ground. The pilots had asked for the runway lights to be cranked to maximum brightness setting 5, but the controller forgot and left them at setting 4. And look at the difference, setting 5 is 4 times brighter. Those dimmer lights created a powerful illusion, making the runway seem much farther away than it really was. So all the pieces are now in place. You have the difficult approach, the cold air trap, the flawed procedure, and now the dim lights creating an optical illusion. All of these factors were about to converge in the final terrifying seconds of Flight 620. 30 seconds to impact, they break out of the clouds. They see the runway lights, the captain calls landing, but, and this is critical, he leaves the autopilot on. By the time they're 15 seconds out, the plane is over 100 feet too low. Way too low. At just 5 seconds out, the captain finally clicks off the autopilot. The first officer screams, pull up, pull up. But it is just too late. They hit a power line, the airport goes dark, and they slam into the ground hundreds of feet short of the runway. The aircraft was completely destroyed, just torn apart. And yet, and this is the truly unbelievable part of the story of the 138 people on that plane, every single one survived. 25 people were injured, sure, but there were no fatalities, an absolute miracle. So in the aftermath, investigators painstakingly pieced together this whole chain of events, all these small errors. And most importantly, they made sure that the lessons learned from that wreckage would lead to real life-saving changes. So what changed? Well, Air Canada immediately scrapped their old procedure. They basically said, okay, from now on we do it. The Airbus weight pilots now have to continuously cross-check their altitude. The airline also beefed up training on the autopilot's limits. And the airport, they got a brand new upgraded lighting system. Direct changes born from this accident. And that's really the big takeaway here. It's so rarely one single massive failure that causes a crash. It's almost always a bunch of little things, little holes in the different layers of safety that just happen to line up perfectly on one unlucky day. The weather, the procedure, the technology, a simple human error on their own may be no big deal, but when they all line up, you get a disaster. You know, it really makes you think, doesn't it? The next time you're on a flight and it's perfectly boring and totally routine, maybe just take a second to appreciate how many of these invisible layers of technology, procedure, and human skill had to work exactly right to keep it that way.